Hey everyone, it's PJ. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a review of the Apevia SFX AP400 watt power supply. I picked up this power supply for about $30 a few months ago for a project I was working on, and I was genuinely blown away with the quality of this power supply. Um, I was a little bit skeptical in the beginning because of some of the negative feedback I had received about Apevia power supplies from people I asked on some forums. And honestly, I got far more from this power supply than I was expecting. Everybody was like, a PV is a bomb. It's going to blow up. It's going to melt your PC down. It's going to ruin your motherboard, CPU, and all this. I was like, well, okay. What's the worst that could happen? So, out of the box, this is a very light power supply. But the specifications of the power rails are pretty good. You have 12 amps on each of the 3.3 volt and 5 volt rails, so 12 amps each, not combined, and a single 28 amp 12 volt rail. Now, Apevia doesn't have the greatest reputation in the market because of its lack of quality control over the years and its bad power supply design. You can generally tell a cheap power supply because of the amount of power dedicated to certain rails. So, like, when there's more amperage on the 3.3 volt rail than the 5 volt and 12 volt combined, you know something's not right. And I think Apevia is really turning the corner on quality control and overall design of their power supplies. Now, people would be like, 400 watts isn't enough to run much. Well, I would disagree. This power supply ran my Ryzen 7 2700 and GTX 1080 while stress testing, and I'll show some of that stress testing later in the video, just fine without any overclocks. Now, when I started overclocking my CPU, I bumped my Ryzen 7 2700 up to 4.1 gigahertz. Then I started running into problems with this power supply. Not so much system instability, but just overall, there were some funny noises coming from the power supply just because it was like, I really don't like being pushed this hard. A general good rule of thumb and just an overall good piece of advice: if you're building a computer, take the recommended manufacturer specifications for the power supply and combine your wattage needed for your GPU, CPU, RAM, hard drives, all that. There's a couple different calculators. Seasonic has one, a couple other companies. But generally, you're going to take the amount of all those put together, and you need a minimum of a 100 watt buffer. So if your components, according to the manufacturers, all added up will draw 400 watts, you're going to want at least a 500 watt power supply. 150 is more optimal to have a buffer there. If you're going to do any overclocking, you're going to need at least a 200 watt buffer. Now, you can get away with less. This 400 watt power supply did blow me away, and for the price, you really are hard pressed to find an SFX unit for this price that is going to compete with it. I know that EVGA, Corsair, and a couple other companies make SFX units, but the cheapest one I could find was a 450 watt unit from EVGA, and it started at $70, and that was an auction on eBay. So it's not necessarily a thing about, there's a wide variety of power supplies to, choose from. Why not get a more reputable brand? But when it comes to finding one, it's, this is for $30. I mean, this is a great power supply when it comes right down to it. So kind of what triggered me to make a review: A, I haven't put out any content in a while, and B, I saw a video the other day from OzTalks, and there's a couple other YouTubers he was competing with to see who could put together the cheapest computer using an RTX 3080. And he actually had Apevia's ATX 800 watt gold rated unit that he was trying, and he seemed to like it. So I was like, hey, I'll make a review on this one I have, since SFX units kind of are on this little corner of the market that no one ever really talks about. So now we're going to move on to some of the stress testing I'm going to show you, which involves basically just maxing out the components in my computer's usage to draw as much power from this power supply as possible without my computer crashing. So here's some footage of me testing the power supply. So I'm running it, like I said, my Ryzen 7 2700, my GTX 1080, 32 gigs of DDR3 running at 2133 megahertz. Don't ask about the clock speed, it's a long story. But anyway, get the system up and running, and of course the first thing I do, and I think, okay, I'm testing a power supply that's already probably not even able to run the system properly, is I'm just going to go overclock the CPU. And surprisingly, my system ran that without crashing. So that was a 4.1 gigahertz overclock at 1.37 volts. And the CPU and GPU were at full load at this time, and the system memory using AIDA64, which is a great benchmarking tool and stress testing tool. And it ran it perfectly fine, but I could smell the power supply getting hot. It almost smelled like one of those old laptop chargers when you sniffed it after it'd been running for about an hour. It just had that like hot electrical smell to it. So I ended up going back to my base clocks and restarting the computer, and then continued stressing the system, or rather I should say the power supply, for the next 10 to 15 minutes with AIDA64, and then I did a Cinebench R20 run. And this entire time, there's no stutters or hiccups or anything like that. So I guess to wrap up the video, the only problems I really had with this power supply was the coil wind when there was no draw from the system, which wasn't actually an issue on my computer with the standby LEDs on the board on my ROG motherboard. I guess those just pulled enough power from the power supply to keep the coil wind from taking place. So I didn't really have any other problems with this power supply. It's a great little unit for $25, $28. So if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments. And if you could like and subscribe, that would be awesome. I'll see you on next time. Bye.